Welcome to the Saturation Podcast, where we have discussions with church leaders about the life of faith and the mission of the church. My name is Levi Pancake. I serve as a local church pastor in Syracuse, New York. Also have the privilege of working with Saturation Church Planting domestically, globally, and today we've got two guests, not one but two, dear friends of mine, co-laborers in the gospel, Jason and Kyle. I thought about doing an introduction. Sure. And didn't think that I would represent either of your many accomplishments in life and ministry. Yes. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to allow you to introduce yourselves. Yeah. And the purpose of this episode really is to allow you to share a bit of your journey with some of these shared convictions, these biblical convictions that we have. Sure. And how these are being fleshed out in your local context. So Jason, we'll start with you. Introduce yourself and we'll go from there.
Yeah. Well, my name is Jason Malone. I am from the upstate of South Carolina. Currently live in Greenville. Have spent the majority of my life there in that spot. Outside of 4 years in the cornfields of Ohio, known as Cedarville. Yeah. I attended Cedarville University, my alma mater. And other than those 4 years, Greenville has been home for me. So grew up there, and then student ministry pastor for a decade. Did some church planting stuff for a while. We'll tell more of that story today, I guess. Yeah. The church planting phase is when I met you and Dwight Smith and became familiar with all things Saturation Church Planting. More on that in a little bit, but that is who I am. Married for 24 years. It'll be 25 this next year. I have two daughters, 19 and 15. They're fantastic. And that's about all you need to know about me in this one. I love the South Carolina Gamecocks and all things sports, and the Atlanta Braves. That's about all you need to know. I love to golf.
For our global audience,
I love to golf as well.
Like for you, explain the South Carolina Gamecocks. It's a college. They have sports teams.
Yes, the college sports teams. The mascot's going to be a fighting chicken. Okay. Yeah, I need everybody to know that.
Just for
the global audience.
Just some context.
For the global audience.
For the global audience, that's right. Kyle?
Yeah, I don't know how you follow that. Kyle Estepp, also currently reside in Greenville, South Carolina. Moved down there 17 years ago to help with the church planting. I grew up in rural southern Ohio, small town of about 700 people. Met Jason first at Cedarville, and then we got connected through ministry in other ways. And family connections.
Let's just put it out there. When he says other ways, what he means is Kyle's wife and my wife are twin sisters. Yep. Yeah. So not only are we co-laborers in the gospel and best of friends, we're also brother-in-laws.
Wow. It's true story. So I've been married to Jamie for 23 years this December. We have 3 kids. Taylor, my oldest daughter, who just turned 20. A 17-year-old daughter finishing high school, and a 14-year-old son in 8th grade, and also amazing.
I know I'm not the host here, but I think
we all knew what these dynamics would be like.
So. I'm ready. I think for people who are not just listening to this, they're also watching it. When you said that you have a 20-year-old daughter, I bet some of them went, huh.
Yeah,
surprising. What a thing, because you just look so young still.
Thank you. Appreciate it. I may have a lot more gray hair than I used to. But
not as much as you could.
Yes.
Right. So, and you look great.
Let's go. I'll take it. Thanks. Yeah. Appreciate you guys. Man, you guys are so kind. I don't know if I should throw it out there or not. People would turn it off if I told them who my favorite sports teams were.
Well, it's something we share.
I love golf.
Okay.
I do love college football. I love basketball. All the sports. I love that. And I cry over a good meal. I think food is amazing. It's new heaven, new earth stuff. So let's just leave it at that.
Okay. So we've had different guests on, and they've talked about how they've wrestled with some of these convictions, how they've tried to apply these biblical convictions. And I think you two have a unique perspective and just view on how these things have been fleshed out, particularly in the upstate of South Carolina. I know you've been involved in other parts of the globe and work that SCP has done as well. Yeah. But explain specifically a little bit of your journey, your encounter, how you've experienced some of this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, one of the benefits that I feel personally is that I met Dwight and became familiar with all things Saturation Church Planting on the front end of actually planting a church. So my story is, like I said, did student ministry for a decade and loved that, and didn't really have plans or thoughts of doing things other than student ministry. It's what I studied in school and began to do once I graduated from Cedarville at a church that is a wonderful church, developed me, invested in me. But as I felt like the Lord was leading me to think about church planting, and that was a real process and a story in and of itself. I'll say it this way. My journey from leaving the church that I was a part of as a student ministry pastor to stepping out and planting a church that is, we called and is still known as Summit Church there in the upstate of South Carolina, that was about a 2-year process. So it wasn't like I had an idea one day or something like that. It was a real journey because the place that I was a part of was so wonderful and kind and gracious towards me. And for me, it wasn't about, hey, I need a place to teach more on Sunday morning or a different kind of platform. They were investing in me and developing me. And I just, as I prayed and processed and thought through how the Lord was leading, I began to think about a geography that I cared for deeply in, I keep saying upstate of South Carolina. That's 10 counties. It's about 1.8 million people. It is in what is referred to at times as the buckle of the Bible Belt, that swath that runs from Atlanta up to Charlotte. And I think the common thought is that it is very churched, and there's a difference between having a lot of church buildings and being churched.
Yeah.
So even the upstate of South Carolina is 80% unchurched. And so that's just a geography that I care deeply about. And I had a co-laborer in ministry who, as I was thinking and praying about church planting, encouraged me to have coffee with a guy by the name of Dwight Smith.
Yeah.
And so I remember vividly, I had not left the church I was a part of or anything like that. I was still doing student ministry, praying about leaving. Had talked with the leadership a little bit about that. And I drove to Columbia, South Carolina, which is about an hour and a half from home. I went to a Starbucks inside of a Barnes & Noble in Columbia where I met Dwight Smith. I was 30 years old, and I sat down, and just how I've told the story in the past, I sat down and listened to Dwight talk at me for about 3 hours.
Many of the listeners have had
that same experience
in real life or through this podcast.
So here was the thing. It was the way he talked about the nature and purpose of the church was everything I had ever wanted to say about the church, but I wasn't smart enough, wise enough, spiritually mature enough, lived long enough to be able to articulate. And as I've talked with people who have interacted with Saturation Church planting principles and thoughts and theological convictions, I hear a lot of that as well. This was something the Lord was already doing in my life, through my life. The Spirit was kind of leading me in, and then I meet some other people that are going and talking about it in such a way that I go, okay, that's actually what the Lord's been doing with my life. And so that's what it was for me when I met Dwight and we spent those 3 hours together. And I had a buddy of mine who was with me. He had come on the journey from Greenville down to Columbia, and we were driving home that night. It was during the month of April. I still remember that vividly. I met him in April. And I looked at my friend and I said, I think everything's just kind of changed for me. And I don't even understand the full ramifications of the statement that I'm saying to you when I tell you everything just changed for me. Like, that's what I articulated to him. And within a month, I had resigned my position at the church to step out into church planting. When I say resigned my position, I went with the blessing of the elders of the church that I was a part of. So they were involved in that process of praying with me about stepping out and planting a church, which I'm super thankful for, and more on that maybe later as I talk about how I'm now back at that church that I left to plant Summit Church out of, and we're collaborating together to plant other churches in the upstate. So pretty cool story, and I'll get more of that and Dwight's influence in my life even through that entire process. But all of that to say, I stepped out with their blessing, and we began Summit Church with 5 families that were sitting in my living room back in 2007. And again, Dwight just became such a great mentor and coach all along the way with me. Now, part of that was proximity. Like, he really was an hour and a half down the road. And it was very kind and gracious of him to spend so much of his time early on in our journey, sitting and talking and processing with me. When I know that he could be in a lot of other places talking with a lot of other people, which he was, but he always made time available to hang out and talk with me. So yeah, Summit really began with 5 families sitting in my living room, talking through all of the principles and thoughts and theological convictions that you guys have been unpacking for months now throughout the course of this podcast. So when we talk about things like whatever God's going to do in the world, he wants to do through all of Christ's people. Or whatever God's going to do in the world, he's primarily going to do it through a decentralized structure. Or whatever God's going to do in the world, he'll do it through a leadership who sees equipping people in their giftedness as just as important as using their own giftedness. And through telescoping. Like, the benefit and the blessing of being able to launch a church with those theological convictions sitting at the center of 5 families that are sitting in a living room, I look back on that and see the beauty in it, and I'm incredibly thankful. Yeah, it's a real, real gift. Yeah. Now, that's enough for me. In this process, this guy moves down from Ohio to kind of begin with us as we launch out. But again, I'm not the host of this podcast, but Kyle,
you're doing a great job hosting.
Yeah,
Kyle, would you share a little bit of your? Well, you've been working so hard.
I appreciate it.
I want you to have a little time off. Can you share a little bit of your journey about how you got to Greenville? And I would love for you to share.
As the host.
As the host.
Co-host.
How the co-host.
Are you working yourself into a new job here?
I'm thankful to be a part of co-hosting the Saturation Church Planting Podcast. No, the work the Lord did in your life, not being from Greenville, to have a heart for a place.
Yeah, I think that's an important part for you as well, how God did some things personally in your neighborhood, in your own family, in your own understanding that I think enhanced the journey long-term of what God was doing at Summit. Maybe you could come back to that too. But I'm in Ohio at the time doing student ministry. We were connected a lot, obviously through family, but through even student ministry things, just bouncing ideas. I was learning from things they were already doing. He's a lot older than me. So much older. So much older.
I don't know if it's showing up on camera, though. But yeah, I'm a little bit older than you.
For the people that aren't watching on camera, like, how would you describe how much older he looks? What are some of the
I mean, the camera does such a good job of making people look
hiding the wrinkles and all the gray hair.
But I think part of it was as he's starting to learn SCP principles, as he's starting to apply them to his own life and think and dream about church planting, I'm just there as a sounding board. Yeah. At that point, we just felt like we were supposed to support them, encourage them, love them, pray for them. We didn't have a lot of financial support to offer, so we were just trying to give them everything else.
Love and hugs. Yeah. A few words of encouragement.
I mean, I think we were wrestling with just how to support them. Well, then when he starts talking through, I remember came to Ohio one time to speak at something I had invited him up to, and we're hanging out, and he starts showing me these old videos of Dwight talking through SCP principles. Everyone's seen them, probably listening to this podcast. It was Dwight with a sports coat and a whiteboard. It was pretty spectacular.
Yeah, the original, the OG.
Yeah, and I remember watching those thinking, man, like something's going on in my own heart with those principles. But then when he would call me from South Carolina and say, this is what we're thinking, does that make sense? Sometimes I'd say, absolutely. Sometimes I go, not really. Like, help me understand it more. But I wasn't swimming in it. Yeah. And so the more they began to talk about and flesh out how that was going to impact planting a church, the more Jamie and I started to believe God was calling us to be a part of it, both to support them, just to purely support them, but also compelled by the DNA, compelled by the vision of what kind of church they wanted to plant. I remember it was right before our second daughter was born, calling. It was right a year after he talks about April, where everything's changing. A year later, they're getting ready. Those 5 families are now going to start meeting in a public space. And I remember us calling, saying, we think God wants us to come down and be a part of this. We don't know how that's going to happen or what it's going to look like.
Yeah, I wasn't offering you a job because I wasn't even sure how I was making any money. Yeah.
It's something about the nature and purpose of the church and the language of that began to really resonate with us as well. So trusted the Lord would figure that out for us. And he did. And there's a lot more to that. Sure. But 4 months later, we're in Greenville. And I would articulate that it took about 1.5 to 2 years for God to actually break our hearts for the geography and the people of that geography, because we didn't grow up in it.
Right.
I did think of it as an overly saturated place with churches. Why does the South need another church plant? Like, I really wrestled with those things. We came because of the DNA, and I think it took 1.5 to 2 years to realize, even in that context, you had historical kind of Southern Christianity and confessionalism where people were easy to confess, quick to confess that they love Jesus, but he really made no livable impact upon the way they made choices in everyday life.
Yeah.
You had some historical fundamentalist kind of backdrops where really the beauty of gospel saturation hadn't, the motive for the gospel to compel our obedience hadn't necessarily been present for a long time. And then God was bringing the nations to Greenville through places like BMW, GE, Michelin, a lot of national headquarters for those organizations, and then all the small subsidiary companies that support that.
Yeah.
People were coming from everywhere, and people like me are coming in going, I love the climate, I love the culture, I love the city, I'm learning to love the people. Everybody needs access, livable, breathable access to the gospel of Jesus Christ without having to come or go anywhere. And I think that was how God meshed together the idea of Summit as a church plant for the need of the people in the place, and this DNA infecting and changing my own family's life and trajectory.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a piece of what Kyle alluded to, Levi, was just, for me, growing up in the church and around the church, and in a church culture that felt like every day was Sunday. Either it was Sunday or you were getting ready for the next one. Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with that. There are people who are part of church staff teams around the globe that spend time getting ready for the fact that people are going to come together and worship. Yeah. So I'm not anti that. I'm pro that. But for me personally, it was this real specific moment where I felt like the Spirit of God said, you are so busy doing church things and you don't know your neighbors, and you don't know if your neighbors know me, and actually it doesn't even seem to bother you that much that you don't know your neighbors and whether or not your neighbors know me. And that was just a real kind of, I remember the day that I was pulling back into my driveway where I felt like the Holy Spirit was articulating that to me. And so I did make a conscientious decision in that moment, even before we started planting Summit, that I wanted to get to know the people that the Lord in his kindness, grace, and sovereignty had placed around me. And that if we were going to call people to live as we talk about it now, to live as missionary disciples in their God-ordained spheres of influence, then, well, I definitely need to be someone who's practicing that and living that and calling people to it from a place of doing it, because that's integrity in leadership within the church. So I began to meet my neighbors and talk to my neighbors, and my wife and I began to invite a different neighbor over for dinner once a month. We don't live in a big neighborhood back in the day. That neighborhood was 2 cul-de-sacs. And we began to invite our neighbors over for dinner, and 2 things shocked us. 1, they came over, and 2, they stayed for a really long time when they showed up. And 3, they would just tell us their story, their entire life story. And the number of opportunities we had as a result of being intentional in our circle of influence to share the gospel and to talk about Jesus, or just observationally. I remember a neighbor coming over and sitting with us, and she said to my wife, there's something different about your kids and about how you're raising your kids. And we were able to go, well, yeah, there's a Jesus component to this thing, which was really, really, really cool. And so I'm talking about this now. I know a lot of people, as they listen in, and depending on where they're listening in from, again, think time frame. This is 2006, 2007. This really, in my opinion, is on the front end of people in the church world beginning to talk about missional and circle of accountability and circle of influence and that sort of thing. And again, in the South, there was still a predominant thought of everyone does a pretty good thing on Sunday, and if you can just get people here, then we'll tell them about Jesus and how the gospel changes all of life. And so with this small group of people who began to meet in my living room, applying these principles of SCP, well, that actually changed, it shaped the ethos and the DNA of the water we would swim in from 2007 to today, because Summit's still going and the Lord's doing what the Lord desires to do in and through the people of Summit. So
let me pick up on that, because we do have people who are listening who are wrestling with some of these convictions. People trying to plant churches, revitalize churches, persuade from the scriptures, their leadership teams, etc. So elaborate on how these biblical convictions began to shape, or how it fleshed out, how you structured, how you led, the decisions you made. Yes, in those early years, but from 2007 to present, because it's demonstrable, it's clear, it's distinctive. We would say it's a model in many ways. Not the only one. There's various ways that we can flesh this out, but in your context.
Well, if our desire is gospel saturation in a defined geography.
That's right.
So again,
that's the outcome.
That's the outcome.
And that's where we start.
Then we would say that would happen primarily through the mobilization of, for us as pastors, the mobilization of our local expression. The people, the mobilization of our people through their spiritual formation.
That's right.
Their spiritual transformation. So what type of people are we mobilizing to get after saturation of a geography with the gospel? And that should actually be done in collaboration with the Big C church of the geography. So this is how we've talked about it. Gospel saturation via mobilization of the local church through the spiritual formation of your local church in collaboration with the Big C church. I think those are the components and the pieces that allow you to get after gospel saturation. And also worded in the core convictions that I ran through a few moments ago. Whatever he wants to do through all Christ's people, through a decentralized structure, through a leadership who sees equipping as just as important as using their own gifts. If those things are true, if you're convinced of those things theologically, then there should be philosophical, methodological, strategic ramifications that hang off of those core convictions. So I'm kind of reframing your question back to you, but I'm saying it on purpose to help people understand we're not just coming up with a philosophy of ministry or a strategy because every church has a strategy. It's really built off of the theological convictions to get after gospel saturation.
That's right.
So I'm setting that back up, and I'll throw it over to Kyle. Kyle, maybe you can speak a little bit to that.
Practically what it fleshed out to be was we're going to value the geography, and we called it target-driven, circle of accountability, like emphasize the place where God has us. I think even of Acts chapter 17, like God determined the periods of time of your dwelling and the boundary lines, like you're where you are on purpose. How can we help people understand that? How can, as a church, how can we help understand that and keep that in front of our folks?
And just quick clarification. I mean, so you're saying we're taking spiritual responsibility to make the gospel accessible there.
Correct. And we're not the only people there.
Of course.
That comes out in a later distinctive, but it was the desire. And then formation of our people, spiritual formation of our people, gospel motivated, growing people. We think of Ephesians 4, it's like you equip the saints to do the work of the ministry for the maturity of everybody in Christ Jesus. Like that, those are tied together. And we needed to emphasize that, like he was saying just a moment ago. Interdependent leadership. Like we from the very beginning, I think part of the reason God brought me into the mix and then God allowed us to keep expanding that was we knew it couldn't just be about us leading it, and it has to continue to develop new leaders. And in the best way, this DNA's ruined us because no one wants to go at it alone, and no one should go at it alone. And so we really developed a desire to go, if it's going to be at its best, it's got to get wider, and it's got to equip leaders in their gifting over and over and over again. And so we really valued interdependent leadership. And the other piece of collaboration or church planting, church partnering was we care about this geography, spiritual responsibility with everybody else God already has
That's
here.
right.
Like we have to find ways to befriend them, care for them, pray for them on Sundays, highlight their ministry. If they're gospel-centered, preach the word, and are making disciples, let's find ways to celebrate them in our midst. Bringing in new church planters and telling our folks to pray about whether or not God wants you to go with them. Like those kinds of things had to happen regularly. And then global intentionality. We also believe God's a global God. It's not just our geography He cares about. He cares about the world. How are we going to take what we're caring about here and make sure we're thinking about that outside of here? How are we going to help our people realize where God has you? He has you on purpose, but don't lose sight of how that's connected to what He's doing all around the world through all of Christ's people.
And so, I mean, part of this playing out practically then became over the course of 2 years, there's now from those 5 families, a few hundred people who are part of Summit. And within 2 years of planting, we went and started another congregation about 10 miles away. Even when before there were 300 people as a part of Summit, we went and planted. Now, the reason we did that is based off of these convictions. That's what I mean by there has to be philosophical, methodological, strategic things that come out of this biblical conviction that you say. And so, and that's going to be live for us. That's going to be live teaching. It's not going to be video. I'm not saying I'm anti-video. I'm just saying we wanted to continue to equip leaders, right? If what God's going to do, He'll do through all of Christ's people. And if He's going to do it through a leadership who sees equipping people and their giftedness is just as important as using their own giftedness, which we would go, yes, okay. A practical outworking of that can be we can raise up guys to teach the Bible. We will equip. Do we feel like that we have the gift to teach the Bible? We do. We think that equipping people in their giftedness of teaching the Bible is just as important as using our gifts. Well, that means over time we have a teaching team of 12, 13, 14 people, not all full-time on our staff or anything like that. It means that when it grows to a couple of hundred people, and you can pick your number, I don't care about that we're going to go multiply where? In another circle of accountability. Why? Because we're target driven. And so 10 miles away in the upstate of South Carolina, it's a totally different circle. The socioeconomic makeup is different. The demographics are different. Who lives in that circle looks different. The education is different. And that's just 10 miles away. Again, it's a practical outworking of a conviction. So that plays out from target driven to the spiritual formation of your people to, like he said, the gospel intentionality, the global intentionality piece, like each of those distinctives have practical things that hang off of them.
I think the only other thing I would add is from a church standpoint, when you're leading people through this, was Dwight and others were really helpful to try to remind us you never get detached from how it needs to affect your own household.
That's exactly right.
I mean, it's one of the reasons I think Ryan Cozy's on here. I always respected how street level Ryan was making it in his own life.
That's right.
Because one of the things we talked about from a church perspective is we need to model it first and foremost. Our elders, our staff, us as leaders, we need to model these convictions in our own home and in our own lifestyle. Then we need to teach it theologically, scripturally, like from the text. We need to show that these are biblical ideas. We're not making these up or forcing them in. So we need to teach our people that these are convictions that the scriptures hold out. We need to celebrate or resource our people, like equip them, actually do the work to help them understand how to make these realities present in their own life. And then celebrate when God does it. Small things, little things, 1 degree of glory at a time, bringing people into the invitation that I think exists, which is what it looks like to be divinely distinct or an active partaker, divine, or partaker of the divine life, as Peter says, in this reality. That, to me, holds as something we still hold dear for our people at Summit and beyond.
Yeah, that's excellent. I think you sharing your journey, your experience with some of this, how some of these things have been fleshed out or being fleshed out is really helpful to people. Jason, as the a new host of this podcast.
Co-host. I mean, I don't want to take the whole hosting.
But you started with
You've
host
done a
and
great
then
job.
retracted to co-host. And so
you're right.
I'm just going to give you the title.
Yep.
Any final thoughts? And then you can wrap us up as we wind down this episode.
No, I think that where Kyle left it actually is the best place to leave it.
And that's your decision as the host.
That
to make.
is my
So,
decision as the host. No, I'll say this. If you want to hold out in front of your people the desire for them to be missionary disciples in their God-ordained spheres of influence, then it is imperative that you're modeling that as leaders.
That's right.
You know, if you want your people to be praying about those that are close to them but far from God, then that should be talked about around your elder table. Mm-hmm. Who are we as elder? Like, who are we praying for? Tell me about your neighbors. Mm-hmm. Like, tell me about who you're being intentional with. Tell me about what silence and solitude and intimacy with God, passionate pursuit of God looks like in your life. Are you in biblical community? Like, how are you leaning into biblical community as one of the elders and leaders here of this church? How are you stewarding your life in a way that puts the gospel on display? I mean, that becomes the central piece of the DNA.
That's right.
Continuing to be in, you know, the lifeblood of the church family. So if you're a church leader listening to this, that's my encouragement. Like, that's the work that you come back to and ask the Spirit of God to show you.
You got to fight for it.
Yeah.
It's easy to get for the ministry things to keep competing with that.
That's right.
Yeah.
Even in the places you're trying to hold these high.
That's right.
Yeah.
So
we want to thank all of you for tuning in today. We really appreciate it. And we want to thank our sponsor. We don't have one. But if you've listened to this podcast and you thought, we've been looking for a podcast to sponsor, we would love to have a conversation with you. We'll talk to you soon. God bless.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Saturation Podcast, where we have discussions with church leaders about the life of faith and mission of the church. This podcast is produced by Saturation Church Planning. Saturation Church Planning exists to glorify God through partnering with church leaders in nations, regions, cities throughout the world towards the full evangelization of those places through the mobilization of the church. For more information, please visit scpglobal.org.